Okay, and it's just about noon. So thank you so much for joining. We are hosting CDRPC, the Capital District Regional Planning Commission is hosting our Capital Region Climate Action webinar series, which is part of our larger regional climate action planning effort. I'm going to kick it off here with announcing Todd Fabosi, our Director of Sustainability, who's going to explain the process of our regional plan and get this going. So, Todd?
Okay, thank you, Tara, and thank you for everyone that's joining or has joined. I can see the numbers still coming in. I just want to start out by setting the context for this series. And this is a list of the upcoming webinars that we intend to have monthly for the next 7 months. And so it's perhaps the start of something that we continue into next year. But the idea is that we are picking key measures from our climate action plan and looking at how they're being dealt with locally, how you can potentially work on them locally. So it's an effort to being able to find ways to implement the climate action plan. And if you can change slides, Tara, I just want to give you some background on our climate action plan for those who may not be familiar. So about 2 years ago, CDRPC received a grant from the EPA to develop a regional climate action plan. And that plan was completed in October of this past year and is available on our website. So anyone who has not seen it, you can download the plan and view the plan. I just want to hit on some of the key aspects of the plan itself. So it was a process over 2 years of engaging with sector-specific work groups. We had an advisory group of municipal climate leaders. We had a whole series of webinars where we shared the draft measures and allowed the ability of residents of communities to be able to look at our draft measures, fill out a worksheet of comments or any suggestions for changing them, and then work them into the final plan. The idea behind our measures is that they're voluntary. This is a voluntary plan, and it is essentially this plan serves as a container, let's say, for best practices for climate mitigation and the mitigation of greenhouse gases. So that's the focus of this plan. It is not an adaptation resilience plan. It is a mitigation plan. And so we have 67 different measures that we've developed to be able to use as, in a sense, a menu. All the measures are not necessarily something that every community would undertake. Some of them are more regional or specific to certain things, like, for example, transit, one of the topic of today's webinar. And so if you'll change the slide, Tara, this is an example of just some of the measures extracted from the plan that are specific to today's talk. And I'm not going to read all these to you. I'm going to encourage you, if you haven't looked at the plan, to please do so. You can download the PDF. And you can also, the other things that we've developed as part of this initiative are a greenhouse gas inventory. So CDRPC had developed an inventory based on 2010 data, and we updated it for this initiative all the way up to 2022 data. And so we have a dashboard now that's on our website that shows community by community and the counties and the region as a whole, depending on how you want to look at it, the greenhouse gas emissions and the energy sources and the cost. And so hopefully communities are finding this to be a useful tool. We've been meeting with communities one-on-one since October to go over the inventory information for their communities and to talk about the different measures and to see which measures communities may want to work on. These are also these measures are tied to work we've done for years with NYSERDA Clean Energy Community Program and DEC's Climate Smart Communities Program. And so there's a great synergy between state initiatives that are targeted towards local governments and clean energy and GHG mitigation efforts. And so this brings it all together within this plan. And also on our website, along with the GHG dashboard, we have a climate action portal for the capital region, in which we're tracking the various initiatives in which data is available and how we're doing as a region over time. So with that, I'll turn it back to Tara to introduce our speakers for today's topic.
Thanks, Todd. So today we have some great speakers here on transit-oriented development. We have, oh, and before I forget, we will be taking questions at the end. So just put your questions in the Q&A box or the chat, I should say, and we'll answer those at the end. So first of all, we have Ethan Warren, who is a senior planner at CDTA, where he leads strategic planning and recently spearheaded the agency's transit development plan to guide future transit service and investment. And we have from the city of Troy, Eric Ferraro, who is a planner working on planning and zoning review and playing a key role in the city's recent zoning updates focused on walkability and better development outcomes. And finally, we have Angelina Apindem, who is the assistant planner with the city of Troy, focused on zoning and site plan review. And she also works on regional safety, accessibility, and environmental initiatives. So with that, I will turn it over to you all, and I'm going to stop sharing my screen.
Okay, can everybody see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, cool. Thank you, Tara. Thank you, Todd. So yeah, my name is Ethan Warren. I'm a senior planner for the Capital District Transportation Authority in upstate New York. I have Eric Ferraro and Angelina Apindem from the city of Troy, who will talk about their zoning code towards the end. So my approach to talking about transit-oriented development here is that my assumption is that you in the audience are generally not transit staff. You're people who might work in land use planning, or you might work for a municipality. You might generally be sympathetic for transit, but maybe you don't deal with it every day. So my approach here has been to highlight some of the basic ideas about the interactions between transit, land use, and street design, and then to show you approaches to improve that connection. I also wanted to point out that the focus here today is for a region which is like the capital region. And by that, I mean a region which has bus transit, but which large parts of it are heavily car oriented. So you might call some of the ideas that I'm presenting here TOD light, or perhaps even like a term like retrofitting suburbia. So these are generally ideas that I think anyone should find applicable, and that even in areas which don't have rail transit or big transit services, these are ideas where you can start getting the ball rolling in a positive direction if you want to promote more walkability, transit access, and independence from cars. So I wanted to also emphasize the three of us do not consider ourselves land use experts. You will not get a step-by-step guide to everything TOD here. My objective here is really just to give you a teaser on what the general ideas are, and to get you excited and to get you more interested in looking more into this sort of idea. Okay, so to set a little bit of background first I'll talk about how transit is doing nationally. Then I'll talk about how CDTA is doing and how the region influences CDTA. So since COVID, transit in the US has faced two challenges. One, increasing costs, just like with a lot of other industries. The costs of operating transit have gone up a lot in the last 6 years. We are hit on the other end by reduced transit ridership across the country. Nationally, we still haven't gotten back to pre-COVID levels of ridership. So when you have less ridership, you have less revenue, and when your costs are higher, you've got a serious business problem. And a lot of agencies around the country have made some pretty big news over threats of serious cuts, even to big agencies like SEPTA, CTA in Chicago, and the MTA in New York City. So the scary prospect of this is what is called a death spiral, where because you have less revenue, you need to cut service, and because you have less service, you have less ridership with less revenue, and it spirals. So this is the kind of problem that we're trying to avoid, and I think TOD is and general transit-friendly planning is part of that solution. So CDTA also has faced a recent budget shortfall in fiscal year 25. So I'll talk a little bit about what CDTA is going through nowadays. So we're calling it our service rebalancing. We had to make reductions on certain routes. We tried to do it carefully so that routes don't get over capacity and that the least amount of riders as possible are affected, but it's certainly not a place we want to be in at all. Some of our routes, like the first two shown here, 352 and 190, have been totally eliminated. So that's coverage that no longer exists. People who live along those routes, a lot of them have no options anymore. And the last two routes are, these routes are still around. They're still relatively high frequency, but they're not what they were before. In both cases, CDTA is losing ridership, and it's kind of a diminishing returns kind of thing where, we might save X amount on operating costs, but we lose some amount less in terms of revenue. So this is only a sample. There are more changes like this in our region. I want to emphasize that I think service rebalancing, we believe it's working, that we'll be in a stable position soon. But again, it's not a position we want to be in. So let me talk a little bit more in depth about the viability of a transit route. So transit, like any business, has to find a balance between its costs and its income. So I wanted to include this screenshot from a transit planning tool called the Remix to make that point. So this is one leg of our Blue Line BRT service. You can see the blue shows where the route goes between Albany, Troy, and Cohoes. The runtime in the orange here, runtime indicates how long it takes a route to go from the start of the route all the way down to the other end and all the way back. So for this segment, this route of the Blue Line takes about 100 minutes. So if you want to know the cost of operating this route, you take the runtime and divide it by the desired frequency. Let's say it's 20 minutes. So that would mean 100 divided by 20. You need 5 buses running at all times to provide that level of service. So the green area on this screen here shows you the approximate number of people who live within a quarter mile of any of these stops and the number of jobs in the same. So at CDTA, we're always trying to find routes which minimize the orange, ideally shorter run times and lots more population and jobs. We have no control over the green, of course. The region is the region, and we don't do the development or set the zoning laws or anything like that. We have some control over the runtime. We plan the routes, and we work with our partners, municipalities, to reduce runtimes through things like bus lanes, queue jumpers, transit signal priority, and proper spacing of stops, things like that. One of the challenges that I wanted to highlight in our region is the low coverage that a route provides in a suburban area. So on the screenshot on the right is a segment of Saratoga County, which is part of our service area. And you also have on the screen 2 of our routes that cover this area. So on the left in the green is Route 450. It runs between Schenectady and Saratoga Springs. And the yellow is our commuter service, the NX, Northway Express, which runs between Saratoga Springs, Malta, Clifton Park, and Albany. And these routes do all right. They get between 11 and 17 rides per vehicle hour. But the reason I wanted to show you it is I'm actually zooming in, and you'll see these little green blobs around the route. These are the coverage area for all the stops on the route. So we generally assume that customers are willing to walk about a quarter mile to get to a stop. And outside of that, you get way less willingness to walk to the bus. So you can see I had to zoom in to show you these coverage areas because they're so small on the map, right? We simply cannot cover the entire region with enough service of high enough quality that people would actually ride, right? And this is a problem we face, particularly in our region, but particularly in the suburban areas where there's just too much to cover, right? When we updated our transit development plan, we also did a review of zoning and land use in the region. These are some screenshots from that report. We looked at all the area surrounding our bus rapid transit service, and the conclusion was basically that support from zoning law side is mixed. So on the map and in the graph here, green would indicate higher support, blue is modest support, and yellow is low support. So here's roughly where the city of Albany is. So you can see there's some good green towards the downtown, then it quickly turns into blue and yellow and on out. So there's a mixed level of support. Despite having all this transit service on these corridors, there's literal laws preventing the developers from building as much as they could near bus stops, which is a problem for CDTA. So to summarize, land use has a heavy impact on the success of a transit service, and this is true for CDTA as well. Development which puts more people in jobs near transit greatly increases our viability and sets us on a positive path of more development leads to more ridership, leads to more service, leads to more development, and a positive upswing where maybe eventually we look at being able to do rail transit. So next we'll talk about what transit-oriented development is and how it works. Okay, so I wanted to pitch or highlight this white paper which the Department of Transportation put out in January of 2025 called Land Use as a Strategy for Transportation, Housing, and the Environment. I won't read the whole quote, but it talks about location-efficient places and how when you build near location-efficient places, particularly transit stations, you reduce the need for long-distance trips, you increase the likelihood of people biking and walking and taking transit, and yeah, you reduce the probability that someone's commute is 40 miles and just not doable by any means other than a car. It calls land use policy the most fiscally responsible transportation solution that achieves many national policy objectives. So land use as a transportation policy, right? So, and if you want to know more, then this report's available online. I encourage you to give it a look. So let's talk about TOD. What actually is TOD? So its most original and bespoke concept, capital letters, transit-oriented development, is a funding scheme for rail transit. So rail costs a lot to build. So the basic concept is the communities that are going to benefit from the newly constructed rail service pay in, and that helps fund the construction of the rail station and the rail lines. And then that community benefits when the rail arrives and property values increase and the potential for development increases. So it's both a short-term capital plan and a long-term sustainability plan for the transit service, because that neighborhood that's built up around the transit station is designed assuming that the residents want to walk, bike, and take the train or take whatever transit it's built around. I wanted to also emphasize the term TOD light. I mentioned retrofitting suburbia earlier. A lot of these ideas that I'll be presenting today are not full-blown TOD. They are meant for a region which I think represents a lot more of the US, where there is transit, but there's a lot of suburban sprawl as well. And how do we actually make steps that we can get to the point where something like rail would actually be possible? And in general, the approach is if you assume people in your neighborhood want to bike, walk, and take transit, what do you do for them? And then the solutions become a little bit clearer. So what is the benefit of TOD for transit? Well, it increases the ceiling of possible ridership in a neighborhood. So in a neighborhood which previously might have only been able to sustain, high frequency bus service, more development leads to more ridership, leads to the potential to now you can do bus rapid transit. Maybe in a few years you can level it up to light rail. And actually, the screenshot here is from a plan for Vermont Avenue in Los Angeles, where they built light rail ready bus rapid transit. So the light rail, the original plan was BRT in 2025, light rail by 2030. We'll see how far they get on that, how long it takes, but that's the idea, is you scale up incrementally. So what is the benefit of TOD for landowners? Do landowners want TOD? And in theory, they should. The main change that happens on a property when you operate in transit-oriented development is you have to build less parking, and parking is not a profitable use on your property. It costs you money, and generally people expect it to be free, and it basically has to get paid for by the actual profit-making building on your property. So when you have to build less parking, you can build more profitable space on your property, and your property becomes more valuable. So what's the benefit of TOD for residents? Well, the expectation is that housing costs are lower. There's more housing being built, so supply and demand. With more supply, you meet that demand better, and the potential for price to drop starts increasing. You see on the right, top right, is a snippet from an article about housing costs in Austin, Texas, where they've had a housing boom. And their table, their two graphs are on the right. So their rental costs have gone down, while the rest of the U.S. and the rest of Texas, the prices have stayed the same or gone up. Another benefit that you can pursue in a TOD zone is called unbundling parking and rent. So usually when you have an apartment rent, some things are included. Parking is often included. But just like if utilities were bundled into the cost of your rent, the parking is not really free. Your rent is higher because parking is included. So in some places around the country, they actually legally require that the parking rent and the housing rent be unbundled. So you rent your apartment, and then on top of that, you can choose to also rent a parking space. This also, I've just learned recently, actually does happen a bit in our region. I spoke with a student who said that his apartment offered the apartment and then a parking space for an extra $150 a month. So for someone who doesn't own a car, this is another way for them to save money, and it just TOD makes it all the more possible that you can offer this kind of benefit. So benefits for the environment. Think of transit-oriented development as a release valve for development demand. So there's a certain amount of demand for new housing and new development in your region, right? So if you build a lot more in one place, you're going to have a lot less pressure to develop elsewhere. So if, like in the capital region, you have a lot of suburban development that's building on top of former forests and over former agricultural land, the demand and pressure to do that will be decreased. And environmentally, you also should expect less pollution, less greenhouse gas emissions, as people are offered more location-efficient places to live, shorter trips, and make mode shifts from cars to greener ways of getting around. So another question I wanted to address is there actually demand for this kind of development pattern? I've highlighted 3 surveys here, nationally and locally, that say yes, there is. The typical assumption is that this is America. Everybody loves their cars, right? But these 3 surveys, in all 3 of these surveys, we had a majority of respondents saying no, they want walkability, they want transit, and they are not enamored with their car. So the first survey, who is interested in car-free living, a majority of respondents said that they're at least open to the idea of car-free living, and some set of that are already living without a car, and some other subset of that are actively looking into it and really interested in getting off of car dependency. The second survey is a survey produced in our own region, which found similar responses. 12% of respondents, active aspirers, people trying to switch off of cars. 23% malcontented drivers, people who aren't actively trying to get off of driving, but would if they could, or at least open to alternatives. And then another 23%, people who like driving, but they're open to alternatives, leaving only 42% of respondents who like their car and don't want to change. Again, we're not trying to say everybody wants car-free living, but this is a very different story than your typical stereotype of this is America, everybody loves cars. It's not true. Last one I wanted to highlight was a National Association of Realtors survey. This one was especially interesting. There was one across the board, majority favor for walkability over car dependency and sprawl. But in particular, was one question that asked, would you give up your large yard if instead you lived in a neighborhood which was more walkable, if that was the only change? And a super majority, like 75%, I think it was, said yes. And I wanted to emphasize the if that was the only change part. So I think it helps us reconcile the question of, like, in the capital region, there's to some degree under demand for the properties in our walkable communities, our urban areas, and our suburban areas are growing. And I think what that shows is that people are choosing these suburban areas not because they like to drive or because they like sprawl and separation, but they're choosing them for other things, for other aspects of their lives. So a big conclusion here, I think, is we need to bring not only TOD and walkability to the urban areas where it already exists, but to the suburban areas where people have said they want to live. Okay, this map here I wanted to share to make the point that transit-oriented development also is not a winner-take-all concept. So politically, I think it's much more palatable than people might think. This map here shows quarter-mile and half-mile buffer areas around all CDTA's BRT stops. And the table shows the percentage of the land by municipality that would be taken up by these areas. And some of them, it's a big chunk, like all our BRT goes to Albany, so of course a big chunk of Albany is taken up. But I wanted to highlight especially the town of Colony, even with this is the farthest, biggest imaginable version of TOD for the region, pretty much. And it would take up 2 to 8% of the land in Colony. And then you'd be left with, all the R1 single family zoned areas left over, untouched. So given what we've heard before about the relative demand for this kind of car-free living, this seems a lot more viable, right? So the zoning hallmarks of transit-oriented development, pretty straightforward: density, mixed use, mixed income, a neighborhood planned around a transit station and planned around a vibrant outdoor street life. Parking management and limits on parking, no parking minimums, and pedestrian and bicycle friendly design. And I wanted to highlight as well, when I say mixed use, that doesn't mean necessarily retail on the bottom floor and residential above. Mixed use can also be horizontal. The main problem is just, massive R1 single family exclusive zones where the nearest commercial or retail location is, 10 miles from your house. That's the problem. As far as street design goes for transit-oriented development, I wanted to talk about two main aspects. The first being first and last mile connections. So there's two critical ways in which a street network affects first and last mile connections to transit. Like I said, catchment area of a quarter mile, but in reality, the catchment area could be a lot smaller depending on the street network. On the top right here is a nursing home that we serve with our Route 117. We currently deviate off of the main road to serve it. The reason we do that is because there's no sidewalks. So the county actually has a plan to build sidewalks out to the main street. When they do that, we can stop running the deviation, speed up our route, and speed up service for all our riders. Bottom right here is, again, the Saratoga area. This is, again, the Northway Express and a couple of the stops. You can see the quarter-mile walk area in green. And then this larger blue area is a 2-mile area. So imagine if the biking around these stops was very safe with bike lanes and very doable. So this is why I'm trying to sell biking as a critical element of transit access in suburban areas, especially suburban areas where coverage just by walking is very incomplete. And secondly, I wanted to talk about bike and walk infrastructure as an affordable backup plan for transit. So even in the best transit areas, transit's not always going to be the best option for your trip, right? What we want is that then biking and walking are the best option for your trip. We want to emphasize biking, walking, and transit as part of a 3-member team that works together. And I included this kind of funny screenshot here from a story of light rail in Toronto, where a guy was actually able to outrun the service by 18 minutes. People aren't going to be running to their job every day, but sometimes walking and biking are better options for a particular trip, and it's important to have all 3 options for whenever they are the best option for your trip. The thing we want to avoid is transit riders owning a car just in case, because we know how expensive it is to own and operate a car on an annual basis. There's also so many more options nowadays that didn't exist 15 years ago. CDTA runs our own bike share program. We run our own car share program. There's transportation network companies like Uber and Lyft, and electric bikes also have made biking much more accessible. Your options outside of driving a car are much more than just transit, and TOD should take that into account. So I wanted to also emphasize some basic concepts that you should look into when you're looking at a site plan, if you're a municipal planner, or looking at transportation plans, if you want to think about how to help out transit. Naturally, of course, ADA access, wheelchair access, and also this image here in the middle is of pedestrian entrances to lots. This, for those of you who don't know, Troy Schenectady Road, which is pictured here, is a 2 ways each direction, center run, turning lane, 50-mile-an-hour arterial with commercial and retail all along it. It's not a great place to walk. So in a place like this, it's essential that you don't just leave the driveway as the entrance into your property. A sidewalk into the property makes all the difference. If you don't believe me, just walk on a driveway like this in the middle of a peak traffic period, and you'll be watching your back the whole way, right? It's not safe. Snow clearance, of course. We spend all this money on sidewalks. If your sidewalks aren't clear, what's the point of having them, right? Bike lanes, I've talked about these before, essential for the safety of particularly of people who are less confident riders. Lots of studies show you build a bike lane and the bikers show up, right? I also wanted to emphasize rail to trail and power line trails. In our region, National Grid recently gave a presentation about their process by which a municipality can have a multi-use path built on their right-of-way. And this is an underutilized resource, I think, nationally. Utility right-of-ways, kind of like rail lines, are a nice straight line through the neighborhood with minimal crossing points with regular traffic. So they have great opportunities for, I call them a bike highway through your neighborhood. Access management, a term that's getting a lot of circulation these days. Think of your typical arterial where every lot has its own driveway. It's scary to drive on it, it's scary to walk on it, and it's not safe. Instead, you want to look for something like here, where multiple lots share the same driveway, or it might even be at an intersection, and then cars are able to circulate between the properties off of the main road. And you minimize your dangerous interactions with vulnerable road users and other drivers. Another term I wanted to put into your head is pedestrian permeability. So on the right is the classic cul-de-sac problem where you live 100 feet away from your friend's house, but to get to it, you have to walk 2 miles, right? And the typical alternative is a grid where you have a much more straight path for any one trip. But I also wanted to highlight how typical cul-de-sac development can be retrofitted to work better for pedestrians and bikes in a way that I think is reasonably palatable to any community. So here I have screenshots of 4 multi-use paths that connect cul-de-sacs to either main streets or to multi-use paths. If you're from the region, you can find these on Google Maps in Latham and Delmar, Gilliland, Colony. These are all suburban areas. You can see here's the end of the Justin Street cul-de-sac and a little path comes out to Albany Shaker Road, and here's our 737 route. people in Justin Street would have no access to the route without this path, right? And the same goes on all these connections. And I like this a lot because I think it'd be hard to fight uphill against the whole cul-de-sac concept, and it's much more doable to retrofit it in a way that really works for bike and ped. So I really like these, and I hope I've sparked some interest. So now I'll hand it off to Troy, Eric Ferraro, and Angelina Apindem to talk about Troy's zoning code and how Troy is helping out transit through its new zoning code and eliminated parking minimums and other things.
Thanks, Ethan. Nice presentation. And thanks, Tara and Todd, for having Angelina and I. If everybody can hear me okay, I'll start to share my screen just a moment.
Yep, I can hear you.
Is that showing up for everybody?
It is. Yes.
All right, so there's kind of a lot that the zoning code covers, so I'm gonna probably just sort of go through some basics, and if anybody has questions, you can ask at the end of the presentation. So to start here, and Ethan, thanks, you did a great job in explaining some details. We'll elaborate a little bit more on here through Troy's zoning code. But yeah, in a summary, Troy updated its zoning code in April 2023. And it changed a lot of consideration for transit, but just in a rundown of some of its impacts here. The code emphasizes pedestrian accommodations. It attempts to reduce dependency on the automobile. We see that these things indirectly emphasize and support mass transit and bicycle infrastructure. But among some other things that it does is it requires electric vehicle charging stations, supports reduction of asphalt surfaces, parking lots particularly, requires increases in pervious surfaces, most notably eliminates parking minimums, which I think is unique in New York State in general. Our new code slows down our process so that a lot of these design strategies can be thoroughly reviewed and vetted. So let's see. So as I just kind of indicated, we eliminated the parking minimums, and the assessment of parking kind of follows a schedule and not kind of a sporadic use of circumstances, number of employees or occupant load as previous in our old zoning code. What we use to kind of indicate this, we gauge the parking by its development intensity now. And this is our schedule on the screen. You see our schedule C, and it basically puts on the schedule what is allowed, how much parking is permitted, and exceeding those permissions would require the use of a transportation demand management plan, or otherwise known as a TDMP. Each development intensity or each neighborhood or use zone has its own allocation of spaces. So, for example, as you see at the top, neighborhood 1 and 2 would allow up to 5 spaces before the threshold hits to provide a transportation demand management plan. And so you can see in this schedule, which you can access through our links. We've got links at the last page of this too, but it is through our website that you can access the code and the various schedules that are affiliated with transportation and transit design. So each neighborhood has its thresholds for things from the number of bedrooms, new construction, renovations. So they do vary, and in some cases it's not explicitly known whether or not exceeding these would be more of a detriment or have a negative impact on the community. So what the code requires is if an applicant or a developer seeks to exceed these allowances, then they have to supply this transportation demand management plan. And in this transportation demand management plan, it's going to cover certain fundamental questions. So just going down these points, should the TDMP shall be, among other items described below, address the following. And again, if you've got questions, feel free to ask them at the end, but I'm just going to go down some of these points. So these are taken straight out of our code. Should demonstrate that the need for parking cannot reasonably be met through provision of on-street parking or shared parking with adjacent or nearby uses. It should demonstrate that there is adequate off-street parking or parking alternatives such as on-street, public, or shared parking sites. The proposed development demonstrates that its design and intended uses will continue to support high levels of existing or planned transit and pedestrian activity. And the site plan indicates where the proposed parking can be redeveloped to a more intensive transit supportive use in the future. So the report can go into detail, or it can kind of lightly address some of these things. We've seen various different renditions of TDMPs. And so I think realistically eliminating the parking minimums here and having this opportunity to provide more details as to why an applicant should be able to exceed those things if they wanted to implement certain things that the city no longer sees as central to transit use. The immediate impact of having no parking minimums is probably most notably felt in the ZBA. We've seen a reduction in requests for parking variances by nearly 100%. I think I can maybe come up with 3 examples that have been requested for relief in the past 3 years, which is pretty substantial considering that constituted one of the most, numerous requests made by the ZBA or made to the ZBA. So eliminating off-street surface parking lots. The code sort of has it does make some serious impacts through this code. In place of these elements like parking lots, you might find more pedestrian site plan elements, connectivity, sidewalk connectivity and parking surface connectivity. Again, just to touch on Ethan's, or just to build on his momentum there, the promotion of walkable and bike sharing or bike riding infrastructure is kind of goes hand in hand with some of these initiatives. So in place of parking stalls, expansive parking lots, the code does require that we mandate bicycle infrastructure. And it's not really listed in detail on here, but we have a couple of different bike infrastructure requirements that center on long and short term. This will also physically promote green infrastructure, in place of expansive asphalt surface. So more pervious surfaces, screening and shade, to reduce it. It does have some reduction in CSO, which is combined sewer overflow, and stormwater considerations. So screening requirements, so that we're essentially requiring all of these parking lots, if they should exist, to be screened from view, in shade, which parking lots contribute a lot to local convection and increases the heat index of any given locality. Excuse me. So the structural development as an alternative to green spaces or pedestrian-friendly site plan elements, you might see more investment through occupant loads. Basically, anybody that's going to be occupying a structure, and Ethan touched on this in his presentation too. Like structures generate income with those occupants or as a, for tax-based purposes. But, the people that would otherwise go into filling these structures, would then therefore be spending money locally in some capacity. We would see any structure that is occupied by businesses or homes to add to the land valuation. And then, like I kind of said earlier, these structures generate taxable income or tax base, provide contributions to the local tax base. So I mean, really, there's a lot of reasons why asphalt parking lots are probably the least desirable in terms of development. Environmentally, as I kind of indicated earlier, when you're not having seas of asphalt, you're reducing your stormwater. And taking care of asphalt in four-season areas of the country requires a lot of salt. So these types of salts and any kind of leaky fluids where cars are not exactly all intact or whatever, any fluids would essentially leak into sewer system. So we see that as a reduction in hazardous or harmful materials to critical environmental areas. I said before, asphalt surfaces produce a lot of heat. So reducing surface convection is a goal as well, and less CO2 emissions with less cars, ideally. So it does have a lot of green initiatives in implementing into a zoning code. What we would kind of look at as far as alternatives is, again, taken right out of our code, as you can see, 28569 F3D, which includes but are not limited to walking, cycling, car sharing, and transit promotion and education, parking cash out programs or unbundled parking market rate pricing, shared parking facilities, support for bike share programs, and provide enhanced bicycle parking and related facilities. Support car share services and facilities, providing carpooling or van pooling programs or benefits, participating in bus transit systems, or access programs and transit to work shuttles. And we had a project recently approved where I believe they do have a partnership with CDTA at 1818 Fifth Avenue, where those that are renting space are provided with, I think, and Ethan might know better, I think they're provided with like annual transit passes or CDTA bus passes. Partnering to establish enhanced transit facilities, such as bus shelters, and participating in guaranteed ride home programs, provision for alternative work schedules, and promotion of live near your work programs, roadway improvements adjacent to the site that will help encourage transportation alternatives. And I'm running short on time, so I'm going to try to wrap this up. But those are some viable alternatives or acceptable alternatives that any applicant can entertain when they want to bring a project before the planning and zoning boards for site plan review and the like. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Angelina. She has a couple of examples where specifically the impact of no parking minimums has allowed for the development of like what we see as pretty good projects here in Troy, and that the parking requirements have been more like turned upside down a little bit, what any other community with parking minimums could expect. So Angie, why don't you go ahead and take over?
Thank you, Eric. Yeah, so for the city of Troy, a lot of proposals or projects have benefited from our new zoning code in terms of parking provision. Amongst them, we have a residential project 232nd Street. So these are they are about 30 units condominium, and under the old zoning code, they would have been required to provide about 60, so 2 spaces per unit, so they would have been required to provide about 60 parking stalls. But our new zoning code made it easier, so they were required to show, like Eric said, demonstrate with a TDMP whether how you be addressing parking. So the applicant proposed provided about just 13 parking spaces and demonstrated to us that there were adequate parking on street on Adam Street and then on Second Street, where they demonstrated that there were adequate parking spaces available for residents to park. And so there was no need for us to request them to provide more, and which is what the code encourages developers to do. Once they're able to show that there are adequate parking stalls, they'll be good. And the other project, it's 103rd Street. This is a light industry project that is based off from our old zoning code. They would have been asked to provide about 63 is based on the number of employees, so about 63 parking stalls. But with our new zoning code, they per their TDMP, they were supposed to provide about 32. They demonstrated to their TDMP that 32 was adequate. They were going to encourage employees to use carpooling as something that was encouraged by the zoning code. So with the 32 parking spaces that they were required to provide, that would be adequate for this particular project. And so there was no need for them to provide more than the 32. And they were going to make use of other alternative parking available on streets and then carpooling, as mentioned. So
Angie,
there are other projects,
Angie,
but these are some of the
I
things.
apologize to interrupt, Angie. I have to only interrupt only because it's actually, there was just a little typo there. It's actually 62.5 spaces that they would have been required to provide, which would have drastically changed the site plan in this. But I just wanted to make that point out because it's a pretty substantially different number than what we've allowed them to get approval for. But apologize, Angie. Please continue.
Yeah, I think that is it.
So yeah, thanks everybody. And I know that Ethan and Tara and Todd wanted to leave a little time for questioning and stuff. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Ethan or Tara. And again, thanks for allowing us the opportunity to introduce our code to you guys in this transit format.
Great. Thank you so much for great presentations. If anyone has any questions, please feel free to add them to the chat. We're going to do it that way with the chat. It just makes it a little bit easier. We've got about 7-8 minutes here for any burning questions to be answered by this team. And somebody did previously ask if Ethan could share a map of the zoning compatibility near CDTA lines, and he did share a link in there where that can be found. So okay, we have a question. What are your thoughts about autonomous driving services like Waymo? And is there a plan for allowing those in some geo-fenced areas? I see a lot of them now when I travel to Austin. Ethan, do you want to take that, or any
Sure.
of you, I guess?
I mean, autonomous buses are also something that we're trying to look into. It does seem kind of like maybe if I lived in Austin, I wouldn't be saying this, but it feels like vaporware to me. I don't know where they run them in Austin, and when we talked to some vendors about doing it in the Albany area, it would have been on the UAlbany campus where we have kind of a controlled environment, and it's a little bit safer to do it. It is included in our transit development plan that we should continue to look into autonomous vehicles. but we have no plans to purchase autonomous buses right now or anything like that. As far as the broader transit-oriented development sort of plan, obviously autonomous vehicles would make it much more accessible for like a car share program. A car share is usually located at one spot, so you always can get to it at the same place. But if it was autonomous, then you rent the car and the car comes to you. That would be awesome. And I think that would be a big deal for, again, less need to own your own car and save money by sharing a car. Obviously, that's the angle I'm going to take on it. A lot of people, they still want to own their car and they would like it to drive for them. So there's that too. But I think it has merit for car share and for transit as well.
So Ethan, I was gonna ask this question if no one else was gonna, so I'm gonna expand on it then to say, because you didn't answer this part of it, would be, is it a threat to transit? And I suppose it's a cost related thing of whether transit can be competitive cost wise compared to summonsing an autonomous vehicle. So what's your thought about that?
Well, the biggest part of transit operations is the driver. So if we didn't have to pay that part of our costs, our cost of operation would go down massively, and it would make transit service much, much, much more viable in places where it currently isn't viable. So honestly, if autonomous came along, I think it'd be a transit win.
We have another question. This one's a bit out there, but I was wondering, what are your thoughts on the CDTA region charging the residents a small fee, sort of a tax for living in the region that goes to fund public transit in order to increase the impetus for public transit?
So without talking necessarily about what's the best strategy, certainly we're looking for more funding, and we could use the help. The New York Public Transit Association has been pushing for a fee on top of vehicle registration or licensing or something like that that would go towards funding transit. So whether it's that way or the way you describe, I think it's money well spent to socialize the cost of running transit because of the social benefits of operating transit. So if it's a reasonable idea.
Great. And then somebody did just follow up and said that they did take a Waymo for our previous question in San Francisco, and it was great. It was way safer than a vehicle driven by a human. So
Sure.
kind of
Yeah.
actual experience there.
I have no personal experience with it, but I'm happy to hear about people who do. Yeah, because I think it's a good prospect.
Give it one more minute for any other lingering questions. And in the meantime, I'm just gonna, before we lose too many people here, just share my slide again and just promote our webinar series. And next month, May 6th, so we're always holding these the first Wednesday of each month. We're going to have a webinar on battery storage and solar, specifically related to zoning, and the support that we can provide for this work. So look forward to that. We're going to send out an email soon, kind of giving you the registration links and things like that. So keep an eye out for that. And I don't see any other questions coming in, so I think we're going to wrap up here. Thank you so much to our speakers. We really appreciate the time, and to everyone for coming out today. And hopefully we will see you next month.
Great. Thank you, Tara. Thank you, Todd.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Have a good day.